I'm going over the dominant insurer pricing model, and this is a model where you have an industry with both one big dominant firm that's going to act a little bit like a monopolist and also a competitive fringe. And the competitive fringe is a bunch of small insurance companies that produce the same product. Everybody produces an identical product in this market. But the small companies are all so small that they don't have a big influence on the market. It's almost like mixing a perfectly competitive market with a monopoly, and we'll see that we actually end up with benefits of both of those markets when we mix them together. And this represents the insurance industry because you do have these big players, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Kaiser Permanente in California, who everybody knows of and everybody's heard of. And alongside that, you have a bunch of smaller insurance companies who are also competing for people's money in the market. So here we go. We have an industry demand curve, which is the demand for all insurance in the industry, and we have a supply curve for the competitive fringe. And like all monopoly models, we're going to have a marginal cost curve, but this marginal cost curve belongs only to the dominant insurer, only to the one that's going to behave a little bit more like a monopolist. So of course, in the perfectly competitive case without this dominant insurer, we know that our market equilibrium will give us this quantity and this price. But we have the dominant insurer in the market, so we need to actually calculate what is this dominant insurer going to do. And as a dominant insurer, this insurance company needs to calculate what demand is left over for us as a dominant insurer after the competitive fringe has already been in the market. So the dominant insurer knows if they charge this high price up here, nobody's going to buy insurance from them because the market price with just the competitive fringe is all the way down here. So actually, for every point above this market equilibrium, the demand facing the dominant insurer is going to be 0. And I'm just putting this at 0. I'm trying not to mess up my marker. So every point below what price would be in the perfectly competitive market with just the fringe, or every price above that, sorry, is going to be associated with 0 demand for the dominant insurer. Now, once we get to this point, demand is still 0, but of course, if the dominant insurer lowers their price, they're actually going to have positive demand. If they lower the price, of course, that's going to force the competitive fringe to lower their price as well. So any point below this, we're actually going to have to calculate what is left over after the competitive fringe hits the market. And we see that at this price here, let me pick a price. This is a random price, and this will be true for any price on the market. The competitive fringe is willing to supply this much. So the demand left over for the dominant insurer to meet is going to be the difference between what's supplied by the fringe at that point and what's demanded by the public at that point. So this total distance here, that's going to be the demand facing the dominant insurer. And we can calculate that by using a measuring stick. So let me just get that. So that's about 6 inches. So let's pick that distance up, take it over here, and make a point right where that was. So basically this distance here is exactly equal to this distance here, the leftover demand. I can do that for a couple other points. At this point, at this price here, we have this much leftover demand, so I can put my point right there. At this price down here, the leftover demand after the competitive fringe has supplied whatever they can is pretty big. It's this much, so let's pick it up and move it to this part of the axis. And as you can see, we're beginning to have a line that looks like a regular old demand curve. And as a matter of fact, once we get to this point here and below that point, the competitive fringe cannot produce at any price below that. So below this point, we know that the dominant insurer will meet the entire market demand. And of course, in between these points, it's going to be a straight line. So just to reiterate, this demand curve is going to be the demand that the dominant insurer, I'm calling it D, superscript D, the demand facing the dominant insurer after the competitive fringe has taken out their chunk. So any point on this line represents the distance between supply of the fringe and demand of the people. And we're just moving it over to this axis so that it's a regular demand curve. So now, given this demand curve, the dominant insurer is going to treat this exactly like a monopoly would. They're just going to use this as the demand left over. So what does a monopolist do to determine their price and their quantity? The monopolist comes in and they put together a marginal revenue curve. And we know that the marginal revenue curve, and of course we'll just remind ourselves this is for the dominant insurer. The marginal revenue curve shoots off the demand curve, so it's sort of halfway in between the demand curve and the axis. And that's the marginal revenue for each product, just like we always see in a monopoly model. And what decision rule does the dominant insurer, the monopolist, use to determine the quantity? Well, they choose the quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. And where those equal is this quantity here. So this will be the quantity provided by the dominant insurer. What price do they charge? Well, they charge the same price that a monopolist will always charge, which is the highest price possible at that quantity, and the highest price possible at that quantity, we bring it up to the relevant demand curve, the demand curve facing the dominant insurer, and that's the price that the dominant insurer is going to set. I'm not going to put a D there yet, because actually we know that our competitive fringe, they're going to have to lower their price to equal this price, or else nobody's going to buy their product. So how much does the competitive fringe provide at that price? Well, at that price, we know these firms below this in the competitive fringe are going to be in the market. So this many firms are willing to produce at that particular price. And if we pick that up and add it over here, lo and behold, exactly like we expected, we get this point on the demand curve. And that's going to be the total market quantity, so quantity total in the market. And of course, how much is produced by the competitive fringe? That's going to be the difference between the two. Quantity by the fringe. And so what this model gives us actually is a lower price than we would get with the competitive fringe only. And why do we get that? We get that because the monopolist, the big insurance company, they can produce at a lower price in general. They have economies of scale. Bigger firms can generally produce for cheaper. So we're benefiting from that and getting a lower price than just the competitive fringe could provide alone. However, we're getting a much lower price than we would get if with just the dominant insurer, because with just the dominant insurer, we can kind of imagine our marginal revenue curve will cross through here, and we're going to project the price up. It's going to be higher than it would be with just the supply of the fringe. So the presence of this fringe keeps prices down. It keeps the competition in the market for this dominant insurer. And what we get is a bigger quantity and a lower price than we would with either one or the other. So mixing them turns out to be a good thing in this model.